Welcome to the Unique History Channel. Today we'll be doing a reading from Antisemitism, The Road to the Holocaust and Beyond by Charles Pattison. I'll be reading Chapter 6, Antisemitism in the United States. Jews were one but of the many European groups who came to the United States, and in the beginning their numbers were so small that they were barely noticeable. By the end of the colonial period, the Sephardic Jews, originally from Spain and Portugal, numbered no more than a couple thousand. In the middle of the 19th century, a larger wave of Jews arrived from Germany as a part of a larger influx of German-speaking immigrants from Germany and Central Europe. Only toward the end of the century did Jewish immigrants arrive from Eastern Europe in great numbers, as part of a still larger group of non-Jewish immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Mixed reception. The first Jews to arrive in North America in 1654 were 23 Sephardic refugees from Recife, Brazil, where the Inquisition had arrived in the wake of the Portuguese capture of the colony. Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, later New York, tried to keep these Jews out of the colony, as well as Lutherans and Baptists, but he was overruled by his superiors in Holland. And at the time, Holland was a haven for Jews fleeing the Inquisition, and there were Jews on the board of directors of the Dutch West India Company, which commanded the colony. So the Jews were allowed to settle, and by 1657, they had acquired most of the rights of the burghers in the colony, thus bringing to close the first anti-Semitic incident in American history. Elsewhere in the colonies, Jews fared no worse than other religious groups who did not conform to the dominant church in each colony. In fact, there's no record of Jews being harmed physically for religious reasons. Most Protestant groups revered the Old Testament so much that they tended to look upon the living Hebrews with more awe and curiosity than hatred. And Jews fared the best in Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had established religious toleration, but they also settled successfully in New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Georgia. In 1740, Jews in the colonies received a favorable boost from England. Parliament passed a law providing the naturalization of all foreigners who had been resident in the colonies for 7 years. Jews were also exempt from having to take a citizenship oath professing Christianity, although such oaths for high public office were still in effect. Jews also benefited greatly from the principles of religious freedom and the separation of church and state provided for in the United States Constitution. With the increased immigration of German Jews in the middle of the 19th century, they became more conspicuous. From 1830 to 1880, the number of Jews in the United States rose from 20,000 to 300,000. Most came to escape the conservative reaction against Jewish emancipation and liberalism and followed the downfall of Napoleon and the failure of the Revolution of 1848. While many settled in eastern cities, some migrated westward as traders. By the 1850s, there were Jewish communities in Nashville, Cincinnati, Galveston, and St. Louis. The gold rush drew hundreds of Jews to San Francisco. Resentment against Jews broke out openly during the Civil War. On December 17, 1862, General Ulysses Grant issued an order expelling Jews as a class from the Department of Tennessee over which he ruled. The expulsion was to take place within 24 hours and was the most daring blow against Jews in American history. Grant accused the Jews of trading with the enemy. Upon hearing the order, President Lincoln immediately canceled it. But the damage had been done. Jewish peddlers and traders around the country became the objects of anti-Semitic attacks that continued beyond the end of the war, as Jews, achieving business success and wealth, became more prominent in American life. With success, American Jews encountered the barriers of social discrimination. Social antisemitism in America can be said to have started in 1877 when the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, the most favorite resort in the time, turned away banker Joseph Schiegelman, the most renowned American Jew of his day. He had been a principal financial backer of the Union side of the Civil War, and had offered the post of Secretary of Treasury in the Grant administration, and had been part of the Saratoga social scene for 10 years. However, when he and his family arrived at the Grand Union on June 13, 1877, he was refused accommodations. Because of the death of the owner, the hotel was now under the control of its executor, Judge Hilton. The hotel clerk informed Siegelman that Judge Hilton has been inscripted that no Israelites shall be permitted in the figure to stop at his hotel. The Hilton-Shigelman quarrel that ensued in the press was outspoken and bitter, and the anti-Semitism that erupted was blatant and ugly. Spokesman of the national stature, Mark Twain, Oliver Wendell, and famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher came out against Hilton, but anti-Semites spoke out boldly as well. No sooner did the dispute simmer down than another American leader stated publicly that he was going to exclude Jews too. Austin Corbin, president of the Long Island Railroad, who was developing Coney Island as a fashionable resort, announced, "We do not like Jews as a class. They make themselves offensive to the kind of people who potentially patronize our road and hotel, and I am satisfied that we should be better off than with their custom." No legal barriers stood in the way of such discrimination. Rulings of the Supreme Court in the 1870s intended to support the trend towards social exclusion, not only in the areas of recreation and leisure, but also in the broader areas of education, housing, commerce, work, and professions. Such social discrimination became the way in which upwardly mobile Jews were excluded from social acceptance and taking their rightful place in American society. At just about this time, with these patterns of exclusion were beginning to harden, a new, huge wave of Jewish immigrations, the largest by far, arrived in America. The repressive policies of Tsars Alexander III and Nicholas II caused 2.5 million Jews to emigrate from Russia to the United States between 1880 and 1920. Years of pogroms, persecution, and unsuccessful revolution drove out approximately 1/4 of Russian Jews. The influx of these Yiddish-speaking people overwhelmed the existing American Jewish community and only served to intensify the anti-Semitic feelings in American society. The anti-Semitism that the non-Jewish immigrants brought with them from the Old World was added to the growing social hostilities and the earlier religious prejudice. But perhaps most significant was the racism of older Americans directed in general against the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. It was this bigotry that eventually succeeded in stemming the tide of immigrations, Jews and non-Jews alike, from Eastern Europe. Closing the immigration door. The racism of the Frenchman Gobineau, who viewed the Jews as a mongrel race and the superior Aryan race as the source of everything great and noble, found its way into American thought. In 1856, 3/4 after its publication in France, his Essays on the Inequality of the Human Race was published in America, with a supplementary essay by Dr. Josiah Nott of Alabama. As a defender of slavery, Nott was a firm believer in the inequality of races, concluding that superior and inferior races could not live together on any other terms than master and slave. Gobineau's racial views found even more articulate and influential spokesman in Madison Grant, a New York socialite and anthropologist who founded the New York Zoological Society. He popularized Gobineau's ideas for our American audience in The Passing of a Great Race, and published in 1916. He argued that the more valuable racial stock of Aryan Nordic origin, which immigrated earlier from Northern Europe, Anglo-Saxon, and Germanic, was being diluted by the inferior stock of Eastern and Southern Europe, Poles, Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, and of course Jews. In the great debate that led up to the restriction of new immigrations, assumptions of racial superiority became more commonplace in the thinking of many Americans. The move toward restriction began slowly. In 1882, Congress passed a law excluding from other country convicts, paupers, and mental defectives. 3 years later, under pressure from organized labor, Congress passed a law prohibiting an industry's recruitment of workers from Europe. In 1903, a law was passed to exclude anarchists, epaulets, and beggars. With the debate over a literacy test, the discussion became more markedly racial. Arguments were made in the favor of the superiority of Aryan Nordic immigrants, English, Germans, Swedes, etc., who had come earlier, over the inferior peoples, Jews among them, from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1869, 1913, and 1915, Congress passed bills requiring literacy tests for new immigrants, but each time they were vetoed by the president. Finally, in 1917, a literacy test requirement was passed over the veto of President Wilson. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts wanted to make it more strict. He devised legislation that was aimed directly at Jews. He wanted to make the literacy test given in the language of the country in which the immigrant was coming rather than the language he spoke. Such a provision would have barred the immigration of Yiddish-speaking Jews of Eastern Europe, who for the most part could not read or write Russian, Polish, or Romanian. However, Lodge was not able to persuade the rest of Congress to go along with such a restriction. In 1907, a commission to study the issue of immigration was formed. 4 years later, on the basis of work conducted by staff of 300 at the cost of $1 million, Dillingham Immigration Commission, as it was called, published a 42-volume with the scientific evidence that old immigration was superior to the new. By giving official approval to the prevailing bias against new immigrants, the Commission paved the way for the adoption of the National Origins Quota System, which was enacted into law in the early 1920s. To curb the flow of these inferior peoples, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, permitting only 3% of nationality living in the United States in 1910 to be admitted into the country in 1 year later. In 1924, an even more restrictive law was passed. Under its provision, only 2% of any nationality residing in the country in 1890 were to be admitted each year. Since the proportion of Eastern Europeans in 1890 was relatively small, this law struck a severe blow to Jews and other people wishing to immigrate from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1927, immigration was further reduced to an annual total of 150,000. America's open door, which had welcomed millions, was now barely ajar. For the Jews of Eastern Europe who had not come yet, it was especially tragic, for within 2 decades they were engulfed by the Nazi nightmare. The Leo Frank case. The decade from 1915 saw not only the adoption of the National Origins Quota System as a device to curb immigration, it saw an alarming rise of antisemitism. In 1915, a Jew by the name of Leo Frank was lynched in Georgia. Frank was born in Texas, raised in New York, and educated at Cornell. In 1907, he moved to Georgia to manage a pencil factory owned by his uncle. There, he quickly established himself as a young businessman with a good reputation, married, and became active in local community affairs. In 1913, he was elected president of the Atlanta Lodge of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith, a long-established Jewish organization, had recently started turning its attention to fighting the rising tide of anti-Semitism in America. It began a publicity campaign against the degradation of Jews in the public media, newspapers, books, films, plays, school texts, and so forth. In 1913, it was launched the Anti-Defamation League. The League wrote to publishers of travel books whose ads read "No Jews Wanted," and it wrote to newspapers to protest objectionable references to Jews in newspapers. Its efforts to curb the worst essence of prejudice in mass culture met with some modest successes. However, no sooner than Leo Frank assumed his position as president of the Atlanta Lodge, when he received his shocking initiation to how vicious anti-Semitism could be. In April 1913, he was arrested and charged with the rape and brutal murder of his factory of a 14-year-old white girl by the name of Mary Fagan. Jim Connolly, a young black janitor at the factory, was also arrested. Named an accessory to the crime, he was sentenced to 1 year on the chain gang. On the basis of circumstantial evidence, Frank, who had admitted seeing the girl and paying her wages on the day of her killing, was charged with murder. The 30-day trial began on July 28, 1913, in the midst of an unruly, menacing mob. One eyewitness recalled the atmosphere of the trial. Mobs shook the area around the courthouse. Men with rifles stood at the open windows. Some aimed at the jury, some aimed at the judge. Over and louder, the men repeated, "Hang the Jew! Hang the Jew!" No deputies made any attempt to clear the windows or the courtroom, nor was any attempt made to restrain the spectators from giving their vent to their anti-Semitic taunts and insults. Not surprisingly, the jury found Frank guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. The case was appealed, but the state of Georgia Supreme Court upheld the verdict. Throughout the 20 months of the trial and the subsequent appeals, a steady stream of anti-Semitic abuse poured forth, led part by the racist politician Tom Watson, who now added Jews to his hate list of blacks and Catholics. His periodical, The Jeffersonian, kept up a constant attack on Frank and anyone who dared to support him with quote-unquote Jew money. Watson charged that such support was given to free the convicted libertine. The paper went on to claim that the poor victim had been pursued to a hideous death by this filthy, perverted Jew of New York. because Governor Slanton of Georgia had serious doubts about Frank's guilt. 3 days before his term expired, he commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. Anticipating the reaction from a mob, Slanton had Frank moved from Atlanta to a better protected prison farm in Midgeville. Troops were needed to protect Slanton and his family. So great did the hostility become that 3 days later, when Slanton left office, Watson denounced him as King of the Jews. He left the state entirely. The frenzied atmosphere reached the prison, where one of the inmates slashed Frank's throat, wounding him severely. 4 days later, a vigilante mob of about 26 men stormed the prison, and they dragged wounded Frank off to Marietta, where the girl had lived, and there they lynched him. The rest of the nation was shocked, but in Georgia, Watson boasted, "A vigilante committee redeems Georgia and carries out the sense of law. Jew libertines, take notice." Watson was also elected to the United States Senate in 1920, found antisemitism to be a valuable tool in his rise to power. It is a particular and preposterous thing, he wrote, that one race of men and only should be able to convulse in a world system of newspapers, agitation, and suppression, with a member of a race that is convicted of a capital crime against another race. His anti-Semitism blended into rising rebellions against the new immigration. From all around the world he warned, the children of Israel are flocking to this country, and plans are on foot to move them from Europe en masse, to empty upon our shores the very scum and dredges of the parasite race. The Ku Klux Klan and Henry Ford. In the very same year Leo Frank was lynched, the Ku Klux Klan was resurrected. Under a burning cross on Stone Mountain, Georgia, the organization that had terrorized blacks throughout the South after the Civil War was reborn. Like the Klan of old, they wore hooded sheets and declared themselves to be the protectors of white supremacy, but this time it was not only blacks they persecuted. Under the leadership of William Simmons, the Klan aspired to unite white male persons and native-born Gentile citizens who owe no allegiance to any nature of any foreign government, institution, sect, or ruler. Oppositions to Jews, Catholics, and new immigrants and Wets, those against prohibition, was added to the cause of white supremacy. We exclude Jews, explained Simmons, because they do not believe in the Christian religion. The revived Klan started off slowly. From 1915 to 1920, it gathered a membership of only 5,000. However, once the Klan started using new techniques of promotion and advertisement, its membership expanded rapidly both in the North and the South. Frustration in modern life was one of the reasons why many people with rural or small-town Protestant backgrounds were drawn to the Klan. Almost overnight, the Klan became a powerful force in national life. By 1924, its membership had reached between 4 and 5 million. They dominated the politics of many state governments, and they were present in the large numbers in the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York City. In 1925, the Klan held a massive parade Washington, D.C., down the Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House. In wake of the Klan influence came violence as well. Catholic churches were burned, and one Klansman who murdered a priest got off scot-free. The Klan claimed to favor law and justice, but more often than not encouraged vigilante justice. Between 1920 and 1925, there were 225 lynchings in the United States. Jews were an easy target in a number of communities. The Klan backed boycotts of Jewish merchants and vandalism against their stores, burning fiery crosses outside synagogues and other institutions on Klan Day. In October 1923, in Dallas, the new imperial wizard of the Klan told his audience of 75,000 that Jews were not capable of attaining the Anglo-Saxon level. "There is not a semblance of racial hate in my heart," he proclaimed, and continued, "Jews are an unblendable element, alien and unassimilatable, mercenary-minded, money-mad." The Klan declined even more than it had grown. Widespread publicity about its violence and organized opposition hastened its end. All three candidates in the presidential election of 1924 condemned the Klan publicly. For many, the last straw came in 1925, when the Klan leader in Indiana, who controlled the government of the state, was convicted of murdering a young secretary. The Illusions member left the Klan in droves. By 1930, there were only 9,000 Klansmen left. In 1944, the Klan was formally disbanded, only to be revived again around the 1970s. At the same time, Jews were attacked from another direction. The famous automobile manufacturer, Henry Ford, launched his 7-year anti-Semitic campaign in the pages of his weekly newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, beginning with the May 22, 1920 issue under the direction of its editor and Ford's own secretary. The paper's war against the Jew was vicious and unrelenting. "When we get through the Jews," Ford's secretary said in the court once, "there won't be one of them who will dare to raise his head in public." He went so far in his search for malicious gossip that he set up an investigative agency to spy on the private lives of prominent Jewish people. Soon it became widely known that Ford's paper was in the market for anti-Semitic ammunition. Not surprisingly, the notorious anti-Semitic forgery Protocols of the Elders of Zion found its way into the Independent, where it was published in entirety. The editors succeeded in improving the text to the extent that anti-Semites now prefer to circulate the Ford version of Protocols. Using it and other material that his paper collected, Ford also called the pamphlet The International Jew. Ford seemed surprised by the reaction. The Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish groups strongly objected and circulated their own writings against the Protocols. When Ford continued his attacks, 116 distinguished Americans, including President Wilson, former Presidents Taft, Roosevelt, Jane Addams, Clarence Dowers, and William Jennings Bryan, signed a statement defending Jews and denying the authenticity of the Protocols. Ford's propaganda was finally suppressed by the lawsuit when the Independent ran a series of articles accusing Jewish businessmen of trying to take control of the wheat market. He sued Ford for defamation, and the case went to trial in Detroit, but Ford settled out of the court. In the meantime, Ford protested to the Jewish community that he had not been aware of his facts of his paper, and at the end of 1927 he stopped his publication. He wrote to Germany to ask Theodor Fiersch to cease publication of the German edition of the International Jew. By the advent of World War II, Ford seemed genuinely determined to dissociate himself from his earlier career of anti-Semitism. By then, it was too late.